In this unit, we will be giving you the basic aspects of kinship. We explain the significance of kinship in social life. We then define the basic concepts of kinship. These include the concepts of descent, inheritance, residence rule, and so on. Next, we take up descent systems, including the patrilineal and the matrilineal systems. Finally, we deal with kinship modes in India. This unit provides a broad idea about the concept of kinship. Let us look at constitution of kinship now. Kinship as an anthropological object and anthropology as the observing subject of kinship were mutually constituted in the middle of the 19th century. The constituting of kinship was not a creation from nothing like divine creation, rather in the manner of human creations, it came about as a gathering together into a new configuration of elements that had previously existed in a dispersed state. From the law, from ethnographies of missionaries, explorers and philosophical travelers, from the classics and the Bible, were drawn a variety of existing concepts of patriarchy and matriarchy, forbidden degrees of marriage, rules of inheritance, and so forth as material for the making of the new thing, kinship. Constituting kinship terminologies as objects of comparative study involved giving fully conscious recognition and formal expression to the terms we have learned as young children and which we use readily and without reflection. Because the kinship terminology, like language itself, is both lodged in unconscious knowledge and yet fully available to consciousness for articulation in speech, because it is at once quotidian and occult, it takes a special effort to call into consciousness the relations of the reciprocity among the terms that bind them together into a logically organized set. The significance of kinship. The kinship system refers to a set of persons recognized as relatives either by virtue of a blood relationship, technically called consanguinity, or by virtue of a marriage relationship, that is through what is called affinity. In societies traditionally studied by anthropologists, kinship is the most important social bond. Although kinship systems are themselves embedded in economic systems, once kinship systems are established in a society, they have an important independent influence on behavior. Kinship is the basis of group formation. Relationships between individuals are governed mainly by kinship norms, and the extension of kinship ties is the main way of allying groups to one another and incorporating strangers into a group. The centrality of kinship in determining the rights and responsibilities of people in most of the world's culture contrasts with Western societies, in which other principles of social organization such as work, citizenship, and common economic and political interests are also important as the basis of group formation and for providing the framework within which individual rights and obligations are articulated. This does not mean that kinship is insignificant in modern industrialized societies. After all, the nuclear family is a kin group and a core social institution in such societies, and the inheritance of property is mainly along kinship lines. Larger groups of relatives also become important on various ritual occasions. For example, in the United States, Thanksgiving is generally thought of as a family holiday among those who celebrate it. A person claiming a kin relation is regarded differently from someone who is not a relative, and there is a strong sentiment that blood is thicker than water. Although kinship in the United States is not ideally regarded as the basis of occupational choice, It does play a significant role in some important aspects of American life. Most of us tend to regard the kinship system into which we are born and in which we are reared as natural. It will seem natural and right to us that certain close relatives should be tabooed as marriage and sexual partners, and we feel quite certain that disastrous consequences would follow any infringement of the taboos. We may similarly think it natural that certain classes of persons he preferred as marriage partners, or we may, on the contrary, think it is very unnatural that any person be so designated. We all have very strong ideas too about what is the correct and proper behavior of different kin towards each other: deference, respect, familiarity, avoidance, kindliness, protectiveness, and so on, as the case may be. All such aspects of kinship relations tend to be taken for granted unless or until one is confronted with the kinship practices of the other people. Initially, different practices may appear as disgusting or inhuman, exotic or fantastic, strange or primitive, etc. Earlier, anthropologists spent a great deal of labor on trying to work out various stages through which they believed kinship systems had progressed in the course of human history. However strange other people's kinship practices may at first appear to be, a closer look will usually show them to be functional. They are useful for the maintenance of the society as a whole, contributing to its continuity over time and containing the conflicts that might potentially disrupt it. This is not to say that all practices are for the best for all members of the society and for all time. One certainly need not justify customs like sati, female infanticide, child marriage, amniocentesis, or killing of the female fetus, etc. The basic concepts of kinship. Kinship is a term with various meanings depending upon the context. This is usually considered to refer to the web of social relationships that form an important part of the lives of most humans in most societies, although its exact meanings, even within this discipline, are often debated. In other disciplines, kinship may have a different meaning. In biology, it typically refers to the degree of genetic relatedness or coefficient of relationship between individual members of a species. It may also be used in the specific sense when applied to human relationships, in which case its meaning is closer to consanguinity or genealogy. In a more general sense, kinship may refer to a similarity or affinity between entities on the basis of some or all of their characteristics that are under focus. This may be due to a shared ontological origin, a shared historical or cultural connection, or some other perceived shared features that connect the two entities. For example, a person studying the ontological roots of human languages, etymology, might ask whether there is kinship between the English word seven and the German word Sieben. Within anthropology, kinship can refer both to the study of the patterns of social relationships in one or more human cultures, or it can refer to the patterns of social relationships themselves. Over its history, anthropology has developed a number of related concepts and terms such as descent, descent groups, lineages, offlines, cognates, and even fictive kinship. The principle of descent. Descent is the principle whereby a child is socially affiliated with the group of his or her parents. Titles and surnames are usually passed down along the 111th ale line. Such a system is termed bilateral or cognatic. The individual belongs simultaneously to several descent groups, those of the 2 parents, the 4 grandparents, the 8 great-grandparents, and so on. This link is limited only by memory or by some conveniently determined cutoff point at, say, 4 or 5 degrees removal. In small, intermarrying communities, membership will probably overlap, and in case of dispute or feud, the individual might find his or her loyalties divided. There are some cognatic systems where the individual has the right by descent to membership of several cognatically recruited groups, but this right is actualized only if the person is able to reside in a particular group's territory. Types of descent. In other societies, by contrast, and your own is most probably one of them, descent is reckoned unilinearly, that is, in one line only. The child is affiliated either with the group of the father, that is, patrilineal descent, or with the group of the mother, that is, matrilineal descent. Theories of the physiology of procreation and conception often correlate with these different modes of reckoning descent. In the former, the father is often given the primary role in the procreation, while the mother is regarded as merely the carrier of the child. In systems of the latter type, the father's role may not be acknowledged at all. Additionally, in some societies, one finds that the child is affiliated to the group of either parent, depending on choice, or to one parent for some purpose. For instance, inheritance of property, and to the other parent for other purposes, for instance, the inheritance of ritual or ceremonial roles. This is called double unilineal descent. The principle of unilineal descent provides the individual an unambiguous identification with a bounded social group that exists before he or she is born and that has continuity after he or she dies. Members of a descent group have a sense of shared identity, often referring to each other as brother and sister, even when no genealogical relationship can be traced. Descent groups are also very often, though not inevitably, characterized by exogamy. That is, marriage must be with persons outside the group. For instance, traditional Chinese society was divided among approximately 100 surname groups. You could perhaps call them clans, within which marriages was disallowed, and these groups further divided into lineages whose members claimed to be able to trace their descent, perhaps for several hundred years, from a founding ancestor, and then into further localized sublineages, and so on down to the individual co-resident families. Sometimes a whole village might be settled by members of a single lineage. The Gotras of Indian caste society are also exogamous descent groups segmented in rather the same way. Functions of descent groups. Apart from the function of exogamy, unilinear descent groups tend to be corporate in several other senses. Their members may often come together for ritual and ceremonial functions, for instance, for collective worship of lineage gods, totems, or ancestors. The descent group will have a built-in authority structure with power normally exercised by senior males, and it may well-known corporate property. An individual's economic rights and responsibilities will be defined by his or her position in the descent group. Lineage structure is often coterminous with the political structure in societies lacking a centralized state structure. Lineages cannot expand indefinitely in a single locality and often segment into smaller, more manageable and economically viable lineage segments. Consider the pattern of land ownership in an Indian village or at the pattern of village or urban settlement. A particular quarter of the village or town may be inhabited by the descendants of a single founding ancestor. Often, the large havelis divide among brothers or step-brothers, and these quarters are further divided among their descendants. In case a line dies out, the property would be reconsolidated. Given the range of social functions that descent groups may potentially perform, it is little wonder that concern with the principles of unilineal descent has dominated the work of many students of comparative kinship. In ancient Rome, women after marriage severed all contact with their natal group. In certain slave societies, the slave has no family of his or her own. To take note of the importance of relationships, the scholars have identified another principle. This has been termed the principle of complementary filiation, which explains the significant ritual and social roles of the mother's brothers in the lives of their sisters' children. It reminds us that in most societies, an individual is a child of both parents, however descent is formally reckoned. Inheritance rules. Rules of inheritance tend to coordinate with the reckoning of descent in most societies, but not necessarily in a one-to-one manner. In fact, it is quite often the case that certain types of property pass from father to son and other types from mother to daughter. In most parts of India, in the past, immovable property such as land and housing was inherited only by sons. On the other hand, movable property in the form of cash and jewelry were given to the daughter at the time of her marriage, with a certain amount of jewelry also passing from the mother-in-law to the daughter-in-law. In addition to property of various kinds, rights and obligations, historic knowledge, crafts and skills, etc. might be passed on in accordance with kinship roles, succession to office, to chieftainship, kinship, etc. and to other social roles and status is also very often determined by kinship criteria. In such cases, the individual status is said to be ascribed, not achieved. It is commonly asserted that ascriptive status of modern industrial societies. There is a great deal of truth in this statement, but one should not underestimate the importance of kinship connections in modern societies too. Kinship system in India. From your general knowledge, what would you say are the distinctive features of kinship in the north and south of India? We will now briefly enumerate here the sort of contrasts that Airavati Karve, the famous sociologist, had described. In the southern zone, you usually find a preference for marriage with certain categories of close kin, in particular with one or the other or both of the cross cousins, but never parallel cousins or even with the elder sister's daughter. On the whole, the intermarrying groups are of comparable status, though the actual marriage relationship might give rise to a temporary inferiority of wife givers in relations to wife takers. The marriage will probably involve groups which are geographically quite proximate, even from the same village, and the bride will already be familiar with her in-laws. In North India, by contrast, marriages are never between persons who are already closely related. A rule of village exogamy also ensures that brides are given to and taken from other villages or towns, often at a considerable distance. The bride, therefore, comes to her husband's family as a stranger. She will always be suspected of trying to alienate her husband's affections and will usually be blamed for the breakup of the joint family should a partition subsequently take place. The distinction between daughters and brides is very sharply emphasized in this system. Think of the practice of wheeling, and the new bride's position is relatively vulnerable unless and until she becomes the mother of a son. In this region, it is also often the case that marriage unite groups whose social status is already unequal. The wife givers being of inferior status to the wife takers, hypergamy, while the marriage transaction commonly, though again not invariably, takes the form of a dowry payment. However, legally taking dowry or giving it both have become illegal offences punishable by the state. But in reality, it continues to affect a large category of people in India. Other differences between the northern and southern systems relate to the rules of descent, inheritance, and marriage. In brief, the northern zone is universally patrilineal, though patrilineal systems are also found among different communities in the southern or Dravidian zone, along with a variety of residence patterns. We should add here that there are a number of important matrilineal groups, for instance, the Khasis and the Garos, in northeastern India, eastern zone as well. Of course, the division of the kinship may develop into major culture area zones can give only a very crude idea of the salient variations in kinship practices throughout the subcontinent. Kinship institutions and sex ratios in India. Ever since Sen in 1990 proclaimed that more than 100 million women are missing around the world, referring to the abysmally low fraction of women in the total population, the ease of missing women has generated considerable interest. In contrast to Europe and North America, where the male to female sex ratio is 0.95, favoring the presence of females, the ratio in many Asian countries such as India, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea is as high as 1.06, significantly favoring the presence of males. Moreover, in many of these countries, the male to female sex ratio seems to have risen over the second half of the 20th century with economic development, declining family size, and the advent of technologies that facilitate self-selective abortion or sex selection. We will conclude this session by a quick recap. Kinship systems are cultural creations that define and organize relatives by blood and marriage. A kinship system includes that the kinds of groups based on kinship and the system of terms used to classify different kin. The functions of kinship systems are to provide continuity between generations and to define a group of people who can depend on one another for mutual aid. In traditional societies, kinship is the most important basis of social organization. This contrasts with the industrial societies in which citizenship, social class, and common interests become more important than kinship. In many societies, descent is important in the formation of corporate social groups. In societies With a unilineal rule of descent, descent group membership is based on either the male or female line. Unilineal systems are found among pastoral and cultivating societies. A lineage is a group of kin whose members can trace their descent through a common ancestor. A clan is a group whose members believe they have a common ancestor but cannot trace the relationship genealogically. Lineages tend to have domestic functions, clans to have political and religious functions. Both lineages and clans are important in regulating marriage. In patrilineal systems, a man's children belong to his lineage, as do the children of his sons, but not of his daughters. Husbands have control over wives and children, and marriage is surrounded by strong sanctions. In matrilineal systems, a woman's children belong to her lineage, not that of their father. The mother's brother has authority over his sister's children, and relations between husband and wife are more fragile than in patrilineal societies.